This truck should have been legendary, but it wasn't. It had the looks, the attitude, and one of the nastiest engines GM could shove under a hood. A massive 454 big block V8. And yet, almost nobody talks about it. Not because it was slow, not because it was ugly, and definitely not because it was boring. People forgot it because General Motors buried it in plain sight by slapping a different badge on an El Camino and pretending it was something else. This is the story of GMC's shamelessly rebadged muscle truck, the forgotten street cruiser that came loaded with one of the most monstrous engines of the era. And the strangest part? By the end of this story, you might realize this overlooked GMC wasn't just a copy. It may have been one of the coolest badge-engineered vehicles GM ever made. Now, when people talk about car-based pickups from the golden era of American muscle, the Chevrolet El Camino gets all the glory. And sure, it deserves it. It was stylish, it was useful, and in the right trim, it could embarrass a lot of real muscle cars at a stoplight. But lurking in the shadows was its near-identical twin from GMC. Less famous, less celebrated, and somehow even more bizarre. Because GMC, a brand most people associate with work trucks, utility, and no-nonsense hauling, decided to build their own version of Chevy's muscle utility machine. Same formula, same body style, same attitude. And yes, available with the mighty 454 cubic inch big block. It was the kind of vehicle that made absolutely no sense on paper, which is exactly why it's so fascinating today. A pickup that thinks it's a muscle car that can carry cargo, and a GMC wearing someone else's face while trying to build its own identity. That alone would make it interesting. But once you understand when it came out, why it existed, and what was hiding under that hood, this thing goes from forgotten oddity to full-blown automotive conspiracy of cool. Let's be honest right from the start. This was badge engineering at its finest, or worst, depending on how cynical you are. GM had this habit, and honestly, they got very comfortable with it. Chevrolet builds something, Pontiac tweaks it, Oldsmobile dresses it up, Buick softens it, and GMC steps in and says, yeah, we'll take one too. That's basically what happened here. The GMC version was, for all practical purposes, the El Camino's fraternal twin. Same A-body roots, same general design language, same mission. But GMC gave it just enough brand identity to pretend this wasn't simply a copy-paste job. And that's what makes it so funny. Because GMC wasn't even trying to hide the formula. They saw Chevy had a stylish coupe utility vehicle, realized people liked the idea of performance mixed with practicality, and decided they wanted a piece of that pie. So they rebadged the recipe, added their own trim and marketing flavor, and sent it out into the world. On one hand, it was shameless. On the other hand, it was genius. Because if you were a GMC buyer back then, maybe you didn't want a bow tie on the grill. Maybe you wanted something just a little different, something people wouldn't immediately recognize, but that still came with all the right hardware. That's where this truck starts getting interesting. Because under that familiar skin, this wasn't just a styling exercise. With the right options, this thing had real muscle. Enter the 454. The monster under the hood. Now let's talk about the reason this vehicle deserves way more respect than it gets. The 454. That number alone means something to American performance fans. It doesn't sound subtle. It doesn't sound efficient. It doesn't sound responsible. It sounds like torque, heat, noise, and tire smoke. And that's exactly the point. When GM stuffed 454 cubic inches of big block anger into vehicles during the muscle era, they weren't building appliances. They were building statements. This was the engine for people who thought small blocks were cute. For people who didn't just want to be quick, they wanted to dominate. A 454 under the hood of a car is already outrageous. A 454 in a coupe utility? That's gloriously excessive. Because now you're taking something that looks like half car, half truck, and giving it the heart of a sledgehammer. This wasn't the kind of vehicle you bought to save fuel. This wasn't the kind of vehicle you bought because it was a rational daily driver. You bought it because the idea itself was ridiculous. And back then, ridiculous sold. Big block power meant effortless straight-line speed, huge low-end torque, and the kind of presence that didn't need to scream to be intimidating. Just the knowledge that this oddball GMC could line up next to unsuspecting cars and shock people was enough to make it special. Because nobody expects the weird rebadged truck to have a 454. That's the beauty of it. It looked like the side character. But under the hood, it had main character energy. And this is where the story gets even better. This machine existed because GM understood something that modern car companies have almost completely forgotten. Sometimes, people don't want sensible. They want attitude. Back in the late muscle era, buyers loved vehicles that broke categories. They wanted machines that felt rebellious, cars that weren't easy to explain. A coupe pickup already lived in that strange gray area. It wasn't a traditional truck. It wasn't a pure muscle car. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't economy. It was this strange automotive hybrid that basically said, "I'll do what I want." And GMC stepping into that niche was a very GM move. They didn't need to reinvent the formula. Chevrolet already proved it worked. All GMC had to do was offer its own flavor to buyers who wanted something familiar, but not too familiar. And that's why this truck is so important in hindsight. It represents a moment when American automakers were still loose, bold, and maybe just a little unhinged. Because who approved this? Who sat in a meeting and said, "You know what our truck brand needs? A rebadged El Camino with a giant big block V8. That person deserves a raise. Or therapy. Maybe both. Because while the idea sounds absurd, the result was unforgettable. At least, it should have been. But timing would become one of this truck's biggest enemies. Here's the tragedy. This GMC muscle truck experiment arrived when the party was starting to end. The early 1970s were brutal for the muscle car formula. Insurance rates were climbing. Emissions rules were tightening. Compression ratios were falling. Fuel economy was starting to matter more. And the carefree horsepower war that defined the 1960s was slowly being strangled. So even though the 454 badge still had weight, the world around it was changing fast. That matters, because vehicles like this thrive in a culture that celebrates excess. They need optimism. They need swagger. They need buyers who hear big block and smile instead of checking fuel prices. And by the time this kind of machine hit the scene, that world was slipping away. That's part of why it never reached the mythical status it deserved. Not because the concept was bad, not because the engine wasn't serious, not because the design failed. It got caught in the shift. It was born into a moment when America was moving away from outrageous performance and toward compromise. And compromise kills cars like this. Because compromise says, maybe you don't need the 454. Maybe mileage matters. Maybe practicality should actually be practical. But this GMC wasn't built for compromise. It was built for the kind of buyer who wanted a pickup bed and burnout potential in the same package. And once the market changed, vehicles like this stopped being heroes and started becoming curiosities. That's how legends disappear. Not with a dramatic failure, but with a shrug. The reason enthusiasts are rediscovering these trucks today is simple. They're weird in all the right ways. In today's world, every performance vehicle is optimized, tested, focus grouped, safety engineered, and polished until it feels almost too competent. But this GMC? This thing came from an era when manufacturers still did reckless-feeling stuff just because they could. A truck-car hybrid with a 454 doesn't feel algorithm-made. It feels human. It feels like a product of enthusiasm, ego, and maybe a little corporate chaos. And that's why it has charm modern machines can't replicate. There's also the sleeper factor. Everyone knows the El Camino. That recognition gives it value, but it also makes it predictable. The GMC version hits differently. It makes people pause. It starts conversations. It forces even seasoned enthusiasts to lean in and say, "Wait, what is that?" That reaction is gold. Because the best classic vehicles don't just look good. They create intrigue. And a forgotten GMC with El Camino bones and a 454 under the hood, that's intrigue on wheels. It's the kind of machine that rewards people who know their history. The kind of vehicle that feels like an inside joke among gearheads. You don't just own it, you explain it. you defend it, you introduce people to it, and every time you do, it gets cooler. What I love most about this vehicle is that it never fully knew what it wanted to be. And somehow, that became its biggest strength. It had a truck badge, but muscle car intentions. A cargo bed, but street machine energy. A practical shape wrapped around an impractical engine. That contradiction is the entire appeal. Because the best enthusiast cars usually have some kind of internal conflict. They're too loud, too big, too raw, too compromised, too specific. And that's exactly why people fall in love with them. This GMC wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean sheet revolutionary. It wasn't original in the purest sense. But it was bold enough to exist. And in a world where badge engineering often creates forgettable clones, this one escaped that fate by being just outrageous enough to matter. The 454 changed the whole conversation. Without that engine, it might have stayed just a footnote, a weird GMC cousin of the El Camino. Interesting, maybe. Important, probably not. But with the big block, now it had a soul. Now it had menace. Now it had a reason to be remembered. Because once you mix absurdity with real power, you get something people can't stop talking about. At least, the people who know. So why should anyone care today? Because forgotten vehicles are often the most honest reflection of their era. The icons get polished by history. The underdogs tell the truth. And the truth here is that GM, in its wildest years, was willing to create a machine that blurred every line. Brand identity, vehicle category, and common sense. That matters. This GMC is a reminder that performance history isn't just about the headline cars. It's not just Chevelles, GTOs, Chargers, and Camaros. Sometimes the most interesting stories live in the vehicles that stood just off to the side. Slightly awkward, slightly overlooked, but secretly brilliant. And that's exactly what this was. A machine for the buyer who wanted muscle without following the crowd. For the person who liked the El Camino formula, but wanted the version fewer people noticed. For someone who understood that being overlooked can actually make something cooler. Today, that forgotten status is part of its power. Because rarity of memory is sometimes more interesting than rarity of production. You can park a famous classic somewhere and people will admire it. But park one of these in front of the right crowd, now you've got a story. Now you've got debate. Now you've got mystery. And in the collector world, mystery is addictive. So maybe GMC did shamelessly rebadge its own version of the El Camino. Maybe it was a corporate copy. Maybe it lived in Chevy's shadow. Maybe history never gave it the spotlight it deserved. But when you step back and really look at it, a coupe utility body, a truck badge, and a monstrous 454 big block, this thing feels less like a copy and more like a secret. A secret from the era when American automakers were still willing to build machines that were a little irrational, a little defiant, and a whole lot of fun. And maybe that's why it still matters, because the forgotten stuff is often the most revealing. Not just about what companies built, but about what they were bold enough to risk. And this GMC? It was definitely a risk. But here's the real question. If GM was willing to hide a 454 inside a rebadged muscle truck and let it slip through history almost unnoticed, what other forgotten monsters did they build that nobody talks about anymore? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos.